In this piece, I'd like to use the above clip from Bo Burnham's critically acclaimed 2021 comedy Inside to identify some essential aspects of the metamodern turn in culture. Well, what is metamodernism, you ask? Well, curiously, in the short span of just 4 years, between 2017 and 2021, no less than 4 different books were published by different authors of different backgrounds, attempting to answer just that. So, you may ask, do all these authors answer the question the same way? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some say no, that these represent considerably different theories and frameworks. I disagree. I see profound complementarity between these different articulations of the emerging cultural intellectual paradigm. Like Leibniz and Newton independently working out the basics of calculus, or Wallace and Darwin independently realizing the theory of evolution, I believe some ideas have their time because, well, their time has come. Multiple independent convergence towards similar theories, and in fact identical terms, is not an accident, but speaks to the fact that people are genuinely speaking of something real happening in culture. To appreciate how all these theories of metamodernism are actually expressions of one very deep structure, though, we'll need to go through each in turn. The case I'd like to make here is that there is a sequence of increasing theoretical depth. As we move from the dipolar oscillation posited of the arts to the dialectical movement of philosophy, to the notion of increasing complexity of cultural codes, to mapping this complexification in terms of hierarchical complexity models from human learning, we move deeper down the stack of structural explanation. Once we see this progression, we can acknowledge the profound consonance of all the theories of the metamodern. In short, all are speaking to the same phenomenon emerging in postmodernism, just from different levels of analysis. Well, let's start where this all started, in the arts. In the first decade of the new millennium, cultural theorists were taking note of the fact that more and more works were not conforming to the, by then, established rubric of postmodern forms and approaches. Postmodern cynicism and apathy were beginning to yield to a novel kind of qualified sincerity and enthusiasm. Depth and meaning were returning to art in a new register after the late 20th century dominance of postmodern problematization and deconstruction. Modern and even pre-modern sensibilities seemed to be making a comeback, even as these were filtered or translated through a postmodern lens that signaled a self-awareness that was holding all of these modalities in check. A new style of quirky films, for instance, by the likes of Wes Anderson, Michel Gondry, Spike Jonze, Yorgos Lanthimos, and others were employing typically postmodern strategies, for example, ironic distance, emphasized self-awareness, metafictional remove, towards very un-postmodern ends, namely not in cynical efforts to expose and disillusion, but rather to showcase earnest and sincere feeling and connection. The deconstructive act used to highlight artificiality and the constructed nature of perceived givens was being adopted towards a reconstructive aim beyond relativism and value nihilism. Whereas in postmodern works, the orthogonal move of higher-level reflection leads to self-conscious critique, skepticism, and pessimism, in metamodern ones, the same move, when iterated further, moves beyond cynicism, and actually winds up leading to a transcendence of reflection, greater epistemic humility, and a more optimistic orientation towards reality. In this way, metamodern art began to gesture towards a sensibility beyond the postmodern. Bo Burnham's Inside offers a vivid example of this. The comedy features a sketch in which a song of his gets its own reaction video, an internet genre in which people respond in real time to a video with reactions and reflections. Here, Burnham adopts this reflective genre to offer an even more hyper-reflexive satire. The sketch opens with the original music video of his song. Let's call it Level 1. Here, Burnham humorizes the plight of the contemporary unpaid intern, subjected to getting coffee for people in an economic scheme that seems, quote, barely legal. After the music ends, though, Burnham begins his reflection, matching the usual reaction video genre, what we can call Level 2. Here he offers some rather trivial reflections about his song. that it's written in the style of older working-class labor rights music, that his beard was shorter when it was recorded, etc. When the reaction ends, however, he then reacts to his reaction. From this even more self-conscious remove, level 3, his responses now become more critical and caustic. He reflects on his first reflection as being, quote, pretentious, says the song is actually, quote, stupid, and, quote, doesn't mean anything at all. Indeed, talking about its meaning just reflects a, quote, desperate need to be seen as intelligent. Then, when the reaction to the reaction ends, Burnham reacts to his reaction to the reaction, or level 4. At this even further layer of remove, he is able to be critical of his own criticisms. He says that calling it all pretentious is actually just, quote, a defense mechanism. He admits, quote, and I think that, if I'm self-aware about being a douchebag, it will somehow make me less of a douchebag. But it doesn't. Self-awareness does not absolve anybody of anything. He eventually determines that this endless overthinking needs to stop, and the sketch ends. The sketch is a vivid representation of the way recursive reflective awareness shifts the sort of sensibility and evaluative measures of meaning-making with each deeper iteration. If the original song, level 1, represents a sort of unreflective immediacy, then the first reaction, level 2, matches the rather basic kinds of reflective, rational analysis typical of modern thought. When these modern reflections are in turn reflected upon and deconstructed, however, we get a cynicism and nihilism familiar to postmodern thought, level 3, which considers the contextual system in which the first reflection arose and skeptically undermines it. However, when the next iteration of reflection comes, and postmodern thought is in turn deconstructed, level 4, we come to an even deeper layer, at which something truly earnest and vulnerable can emerge. Psychological defense mechanisms are owned, and a deeper moral responsibility is taken for life's conditions, i.e., cynicism by itself does not, quote, absolve anyone. In the deconstruction of deconstruction, Burnham thus moves past cynicism and nihilism to something else. That something else is the metamodern sensibility that infuses inside as a whole, as well as an increasing corpus of metamodern art and cultural production. This is what the cultural theorists identified and named. In all cases, though, this deconstruction of deconstruction is a defining aspect of metamodernism, wherein it always serves a reconstructive end. Burnham's insight is recognized as exemplary of the metamodern sensibility by cultural theorists. Historically, the cultural studies framing of metamodernism appeared first, and was the first to successfully heed Linda Hutchins' 1992 call to name the cohering expression of postmodernism for the 21st century. The multiple meanings Vermeulen and von Daniker offered of the Greek prefix meta here were meant to speak simultaneously to metamodernism's tendency to, quote, oscillate between meta, modern sincerity, and postmodern irony, while also recognizing that the product of this oscillation lies somewhere beyond meta, them. As Vermeulen and von Daniker put it in their seminal 2010 article on the topic, quote, ontologically, metamodernism oscillates between the modern and the postmodern. It oscillates between a modern enthusiasm and a postmodern irony, between hope and melancholy, between naivete and knowingness, empathy and apathy, unity and plurality, totality and fragmentation, purity and ambiguity. Indeed, by oscillating to and fro or back and forth, the metamodern negotiates between the modern and the postmodern. One should be careful not to think of this oscillation as a balance, however. Rather, it is a pendulum swinging between 2, 3, 5, 10 innumerable poles. Each time the metamodern enthusiasm swings toward fanaticism, gravity pulls it back toward irony. The moment its irony sways toward apathy, gravity pulls it back towards enthusiasm. This ability to temper modern optimism with postmodern skepticism is what allows for the recrudescence of things like meaning, depth, even myth and meta-narratives, without succumbing to the pitfalls of what Terry Eagleton called modernity's, quote, fetish of the totality. By toggling between perspectives, even totalities are held loosely in the light of plurality. but not so loosely as to succumb to postmodernity's cynicism and radical relativism. This allows the metamodern episteme to move beyond postmodern deconstruction by means of such deconstruction towards new reconstructive efforts. Irmtraud Huber and Wolfgang Funk's essay, Reconstructing Depth, Authentic Fiction and Responsibility, in Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism, captures the aesthetic strategy by means of which reconstructive efforts are attempted. They name a, quote, literature of reconstruction, quote, in which recent narratives take their cue from postmodernist insights and deconstructive impulses, but explore the ways in which fictionality and meta-referentiality may serve in the endeavor to reconstruct some kind of meaning that allows for intersubjective communication, for human connection, and for a paradoxical authenticity. Such are the hallmarks, I would argue, of metamodern art more broadly, which can be seen more holistically as an art of reconstruction. We see this clearly in Inside, where increasing ironic distance, which grows more absurd with each iteration of reaction in Burnham's video, actually leads to a newfound sense of paradoxical authenticity through sincerity, vulnerability, and responsibility. Going meta on the post leads to a new sensibility, a metamodern sensibility. Since its identification in the arts, more aspects of the metamodern have continued to emerge, adding greater depth and further nuance to its theorization. So, in 2021, historian and philosopher Jason Ananda Josephson Storm published his systematic philosophy, Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. Though Storm's point of entry is quite different from the cultural studies theorists, his articulation of a metamodern philosophical paradigm turns out to be profoundly consonant with the cultural studies framing. Quote, Metamodernism is what we get, he writes, when we take the strategies associated with postmodernism and productively reduplicate and turn them in on themselves. This will entail disturbing the symbolic system of post-structuralism, producing a genealogy of genealogies, deconstructing deconstruction, and providing a therapy for therapeutic philosophy. In this sense, for Storm, the, quote, meta prefix here is primarily meant to suggest a higher or second-order position beyond postmodernism. To do so requires a dialectical move, what in Hegelian terms is called the negation of the negation. As Storm says, quote, in sum, I aim to move beyond deconstruction by radicalizing it, or turning it inside out. While it may sound paradoxical, negating negativity is actually the beginning of a positive gesture that authorizes the new accumulation of knowledge. Advancing the theorization of metamodernism beyond the notion of a period defined by oscillation, Storm writes, quote, most fundamentally, metamodernism is an attempt to give rise to the next phase of the dialectic, or to advance the movement of thought in Hegelian terms. Rather than just a response to postmodernism or an oscillation between modernist and postmodernist modes, metamodernism is an overcoming of both. But insofar as postmodernism is itself primarily a negation of the preceding mode of modernism, metamodernism must negate postmodernism in turn without merely returning to the previous system. Thus, in Hegelian terms, metamodernism represents the sublation or Aufheben of all that preceded it. Not only does this dialectical move explain how and why a, quote, deconstruction of deconstruction is to be undertaken, it more ambitiously positions metamodernism as integrating, quote, all that preceded it from this higher order vantage. Well, this makes sense, since surely modalities like earnestness, naivete, idealism, and sincerity are by no means the hallmarks of modernism alone. Indeed, compared to traditionalism, modernism is itself skeptical, cynical, and reflective. Perhaps metamodernism isn't just relating the postmodern and the modern then, but also more naive forms of pre-modern sensibilities too. We can use Storm's dialectical framing of metamodernism to better understand Burnham's reaction video. Here, each new level represents another advancement of the dialectic, as Burnham comes into conversation with more and more levels of reflection. As he does, the sensibility shifts, as the material he is engaging with becomes increasingly laid bare to awareness. In this sense, we can see level 1 leading to the modern analysis of level 2, this leading to the postmodern critique of level 3, and this leading to the metamodern critique of that critique, negation of the negation, that leads to a new, positive reconstructive frame. Understanding metamodernism dialectically, then, we can see that the oscillation named by Vermeulen and von Daniker is actually a form of synthesis. However, it is, as Storm notes, necessarily a synthesis of, quote, all that preceded it, not just the modern and the postmodern. Such a view gets us closer to theorizing the metamodern in terms of an integration of all the previous cultural codes, meaning metamodernism is itself complex. This brings us to the complexification models of metamodernism, which are the sort I emphasize in my own work, and which represent, I think, the most thorough framework for understanding the term. Lena Rachel Anderson's 2019 Metamodernity, Meaning and Hope in a Complex World, reflects a version of this strand. There, Anderson maps multiple cultural codes, adding to the modern and postmodern of metamodernism also the pre-modern and indigenous. For Anderson, then, quote, metamodernism is the incipient appearance in the arts of, quote, metamodernity, which represents, quote, a cultural code integrating all four previous cultural codes, indigenous, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, not just the oscillation between modern and postmodern. She suggests that, quote, we need to move beyond postmodernism, where we can both deconstruct our value hierarchies, imagine communities, collective imaginaries, and epistemologies, and keep them and strengthen them at the same time. In this way, we retain the insights of the postmodern code from a more complex vantage that is able to integrate it, as well as the others, in a multi-layered perspective. In his own 2019 book, The World We Create, From God to Market, not even one of the four mentioned above, Thomas Bjorkman, one-time co-author with Anderson, takes a similar approach, seeing metamodern reconstruction precisely as the integration of multiple perspectives into a more complex, higher-order whole. Whereas postmodernity brought epistemes themselves to the fore, thereby relativizing all to one another, metamodernity sees the complexifying map in which these perspectives unfold, allowing us to integrate the insights of each as contextually appropriate. Quote, instead of choosing, he writes, between modernism's totalization of creation and postmodernism's deconstruction, we could aspire towards reconstruction, i.e., putting together the many criticized and deconstructed parts of reality into new entireties. And instead of choosing between the dubious claims of modernity's, largely mythological, grand narratives, and postmodernism's emphasis on different interpretations, smaller narratives, and thereby fractured historical consciousness, the new perspective could attempt to coordinate the many interpretations and smaller narratives into an overarching narrative, a so-called meta-narrative, the conscious creation of overarching, partially fictive narratives. Such is the aspiration of the, quote, metamodern perspective, says Bjorkman, which represents the next stage in social complexification after the earlier cultural codes, indigenous/animist, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. Using the language of complexity science, Bjorkman sees the evolution of these codes as following the pattern of other complex adaptive systems, which undergo phase transitions at certain bifurcation points that either cause a breakthrough to a new level of complexity or a breakdown. His framing of the emerging metamodern movement as representative of just such a social tipping point has been influential, with complexity science serving as the chief paradigm informing this framing. We can see that complexification, though, is just a more detailed way to talk about dialectics. In the dialectic, two things are synthesized to form a third thing that somehow contains them both while also being something greater than either. Quote, the whole is more than the sum of its parts, as complexity theorists put it. The integral philosopher Ken Wilber used the phrase, quote, transcend and include to express this essentially Hegelian notion. But that's precisely what complexifying entities do. They include the prior stages while also transcending them. Complexity theory, then, simply offers us a more theoretically and empirically robust language for speaking of dialectical advance. In thinking about Burnham's reaction video, we can thus say that each new reaction becomes more complex than the last, as more and more information is being responded to. We get a nice visualization of this in the way the video literally becomes increasingly nested within itself, a whole with more and more parts. Complexification, like dialectic, is an iterative, recursive process. Level 1 is included in Level 2, which transcends it. Level 2 is included in Level 3, which transcends it, and so on. As this happens, sensibility shifts. Metamodernism thus refers to a specific stage in this complexification process, as art and cultural production more broadly come to reflect on the reflection of the reflection. The work of Hansi Freinacht represents the most complete theorization of the complexity take on metamodernism, as it brings to bear some of the best constructivist models of informational hierarchical complexity to articulate why and how cultural codes indeed complexify. Freinacht uses the post-Piagetian model of hierarchical complexity, or MHC, to interpret the various cultural codes, seeing in them symbolic networks linked together according to its various stages. Like Storm, Freinacht's approach is explicitly dialectical, with metamodernism offering the next stage of intellectual history by means of attaining a higher vantage from which to reflect upon and critique postmodernism. That is, to reconstructively deconstruct deconstruction. So Freinacht hails as, quote, the metamodern dictum, after deconstruction must follow reconstruction. In a literal dialectic, or dialogue, he writes between the metamodern perspective and the postmodern one, the metamodernist assails, quote, if you want to be progressive, you have to admit that progress is at least provisionally possible, which then necessitates that you define, at least for the time being, in what direction such progress can and should unfold. If you see that social reality is constructed, that it is a form of patterned meta-narrative, and that there are serious gaps and limitations in that narrative, aren't you obliged to try to reconstruct it? To create a new story about humanity, society, reality, and progress? To suggest a proto-synthesis? And if you want to include the excluded voices, don't you need to show at least some solidarity with all perspectives, even the ones you don't like or that you feel superior to? In short, if postmodernism gained a higher vantage on the various perspectives or epistemes, it also acquired a blind spot to all the ways its own perspective engaged in performative contradictions or did not carry through its own logic far enough. The dialogue concludes, quote, Dear Pomo, you have been monolithic in your embrace of multiplicity, narrow-minded in your attempts at open-mindedness, judgmental in your non-judgment, hierarchical in your anti-hierarchy. In a few words, your problem is not that you have been too critical, postmodern, and multiplistic. You have not been nearly critical, postmodern, and multiplistic enough. Thus, metamodernism constitutes the application to postmodernism of its own postmodern logic. As this recursion occurs, we get complexification of metamemes. According to Freinacht, ideas at similar levels of complexity logically connect into coherent conceptual complexes, cultural memes coming together into metamemes, which are logically tied together due to their shared complexity level. In this sense, the code has a life of its own, we might say, in the sense that ideas at a given complexity level will tend to operate in conjunction with other ideas at their same level. For instance, with MHC Stage 10 abstract thought, abstract concepts become possible, which can allow for the production of conceptual memes like goodness, or truth, or evil, all capitalized and in the abstract absolute sense, to enter into cultural discourse. But rather than remaining isolated memes, they connect together into intra-level meta-mimetic complexes by all individuals able to operate Stage 10 abstract thought with access to such code. So the meme of goodness stands in relation to the meme of evil in a way that mutually relate to the meme of truth, and so on. Advancing the dialectic to a higher vantage, at MHC Stage 11 Formal, relationships among those relations enter the picture. Goodness refers to things when X conditions obtain. Truth is made more or less apparent depending on Y, etc. Now, these relational concepts can be networked together into a coherent logical structure by those at this complexity level with access to this code. The ensuing metameme of concepts at the formal level will look and feel quite different from the one organized according to only abstract absolutes. Each represents its own gestalt, I would say, or better, its own Umwelt, a coherent sense-making totality structured according to a given level of symbolic complexity. Freinacht writes, quote, "Each of these metamemes operates as a set of thousands of propositions and assumptions about the world which interlock into a self-supporting whole, a kind of ecosystem or equilibrium. Each of them is a kind of underlying structure of the symbolic universes that constitute our lived and shared realities. So each one of them roughly have an ontology, theory of reality, of what is really real, an ideology, theory of what is right and good, and an identity, an idea of who or what the self is." Carrying to completion this analysis of cultural codes in terms of MHC stages, we see that postmodernism corresponds to stage 12 systematic thought, and metamodernism stage 13 meta-systematic thought. Metamodernism, then, is the cultural code that coheres at stage 13 symbolic complexity, which can see the relations that hold across systems such that it can identify culture itself as a learning/complexifying process. It is the level at which dialectic becomes core to the code itself. If that sounds complicated, it is. But no one ever said cultural analysis must be easy. Anyone who has not grappled with the logic of cultural code complexification in depth shouldn't be so quick to dismiss such ideas or write them off as not real metamodernism, quote unquote. To my mind, they offer the most thorough explanation of all that we have been considering here, with profound implications for how we think about metamodernism and culture more broadly. In sum, says Freinacht, metamodernism is a stage of development, both 1, individual, and 2, collective, cohered according to 3, an abstract pattern of symbolic complexity called a metameme, all of which manifests as 4, a particular cultural phase in history, yet also defines 5, a cultural movement, some members of which prescriptively advocate 6, a specific developmentally informed political project. And Freinacht says that the term metamodernism can refer to all 6 of these dimensions, which interrelate with one another, and to which the cultural and philosophical articulations can themselves be mapped. Returning to Burnham, we might posit that level 2 of his reaction video offers an analysis at MHC stage 11 formal, level 3 a more postmodern critique at MHC stage 12 systematic, and level 4 a stage 13 meta-systematic reflection that is able to take into its ken multiple systems, levels 1 through 3, and speak from the insight of that vantage. The result is a reconstructive deconstruction of deconstruction, a meta-systematic analysis of systematic thought, which offers an advance out of skepticism and cynicism towards clarity and hope. So, what can we say about the metamodern cultural code in general terms? Well, all seem to agree that it moves beyond postmodern relativism, cynicism, and nihilism towards a sensibility that returns to sincerity through/by means of irony, that it acquires a new naivete even after being hyper-informed or reflective, and affirms idealistic aspirations out of a cautious pragmatism. It turns skepticism on itself and deconstructs deconstruction, whereby it reconstructs a more generative, affirmational modality instead of ideas. It progresses by means of a dialectic movement, creating a unique third thing from a prior polarity. And whether you choose to speak of all this as oscillation, dialectic, complexity, or MHC stage is up to you. My point is only to show that all of these framings are speaking about the same phenomenon, namely the metamodern turn in culture. That, anyway, is my reflection on the reflection on the reflection.